Shadows follow their owners. But when Ethan noticed his shadow moving on its own, he realized he wasn't alone. Ethan had always been practical. He didn't believe in ghosts or omens, but when he moved into his new apartment, something felt off. It wasn't the creaky floors or the drafty windows. It was the way his shadow seemed wrong. At first, it was subtle, a flicker in the wrong direction, a lag when he moved. A trick of the light, he told himself. Then it started watching him. The apartment was a cheap find, a one-bedroom unit in a decaying building with flickering fluorescent hallway lights and an elevator that rattled like it might give out at any second. It wasn't much, but it was his. Ethan worked nights, which meant he often came home when the world was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you hear things you shouldn't. Phantom knocks, faint shuffling footsteps from the apartment above, even though no one lived there. He shrugged it off. The building was old. Old buildings made noise, but shadows didn't. One evening, as he passed by his hallway mirror, he noticed it. His shadow wasn't aligned with his body. It was slightly off-center, the head tilted at an unnatural angle. He froze, moved his hand. The shadow didn't move. It stood still, waiting. A deep unease settled into his stomach. He shook off the feeling and turned away. But in the back of his mind, something nagged at him. Shadows weren't supposed to wait. Ethan began testing it, turning sharply, waving, jumping. His shadow eventually followed, but there was always a delay. The first time it spoke, he thought he imagined it. It was late. The glow of his television flickered in the dim living room, casting long, stretching shapes across the walls. He was dozing off on the couch when he heard it. A whisper, so faint it could have been the wind through the cracks in the window frame, but it wasn't. "Why did you leave me?" His breath hitched in his throat. The room was empty. The television buzzed with the static of a dead channel. He grabbed the remote and switched it off, plunging the apartment into darkness. The whisper came again, this time closer. "Don't turn away." Ethan bolted upright, fumbling for the lamp. Light flooded the room, harsh and fluorescent. His pulse thundered in his ears. The shadow lay still, obedient against the wall. He didn't sleep that night. The next morning, the unease clung to him. Every movement felt watched. Every step echoed back to him with a fraction of a second's delay, like something was just barely out of sync with the world around him. That night, the air felt thick, oppressive. His shadow stretched longer than it should have. He turned the lights on and off repeatedly, watching it shrink and grow, but something was wrong. The edges weren't crisp. They bled into the darkness, shifting ever so slightly when he wasn't looking directly at them. Then the lights flickered, just once. When they came back on, his shadow was standing, not lying against the wall, not attached to his feet, standing, facing him. Ethan stumbled back, his pulse hammering in his ears. The shadow didn't move, didn't sway like a natural cast of his body. It was still, too still, like it was waiting for something. The light flickered again. The shadow took a step forward. Ethan lunged for the light switch and slammed it up and down. The bulb sputtered, struggled, then flared to life. Blinding, pure white. The shadow was gone, but something else had changed. His reflection in the hallway mirror wasn't facing the right direction. It stood slightly turned, looking just past him. He turned sharply to check behind him. Nothing. When he looked back at the mirror, his reflection had returned to normal. Ethan didn't sleep for days. Every shadow seemed darker, stretched longer. The fluorescent lights in the hallway outside his door dimmed every time he walked past, like the electricity itself was afraid to illuminate him. Then one night, his phone buzzed. An unknown number. No message, just a blank notification. He ignored it. Minutes later, another. And another. The fourth one contained a single word. Look. The screen of his phone dimmed suddenly, the reflection showing only his silhouette. Only, there were two. One was taller. He spun around. Nothing. Just his apartment, empty and silent. But in the reflection of his darkened phone screen, the second shadow smiled. His breath came in ragged gasps. He grabbed his coat and rushed to the door, wrenching it open, only to find the hallway lights flickering wildly, the walls stretched long and distorting. It was like a bad VHS tape, glitching, skipping frames. The air felt wrong, heavy with something unseen pressing against his chest. The door slammed shut behind him. When he turned, his shadow was still inside the apartment, staring at him through the peephole. The world wavered. The floor beneath his feet wasn't solid anymore. It was like he was stepping into a place that wasn't quite real. He reached for the doorknob, but his fingers passed through it. His shadow, his own shadow, pressed its hand against the peephole from the other side, the shape distorting as if trying to push its way through. The last thing he heard was his own voice, whispered from the other side of the door. "You left me behind." The apartment was found empty, his keys, phone, and wallet untouched on the kitchen counter. Only one thing was missing: his shadow. And if you stand in that apartment at night, sometimes you'll see it, waiting for someone new. Some things are meant to stay attached. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. But always make sure your shadow moves when you do.
It started as an itch. By the time Alex realized what was happening, it was already too late. Alex had always been healthy, rarely sick, always careful. So when a small red lump appeared on his arm, he ignored it. Just a bug bite. Nothing serious. Then it started to move. The lump itched constantly, a deep, maddening sensation beneath the skin. He scratched at it until it bled, but the relief never lasted. And then, one night, he felt something shift under his fingers. A ripple, a twitch, a movement that was not his own. By morning the lump had grown, dark veins spread outward like roots under his skin. The flesh pulsed, too warm, too alive. He should have gone to the doctor, but something told him not to. The changes spread quickly. His arm ached, stiff and foreign. The lump had split open, revealing something beneath, something with teeth. He covered it with bandages, tried to ignore the whispering in the back of his mind. It wasn't real. He was imagining it. Then he saw the tendrils, thin, wiry appendages, curling from the wound like roots searching for soil. They slithered under his skin, disappearing up his arm, burrowing deeper. He tried to cut them out. The pain was unbearable, his vision blurring as the knife sank into his own flesh. But the thing inside him fought back. It moved. A dozen tiny limbs pushed through his skin, wriggling, latching onto muscle and bone. His fingers locked, his body stiffened. His skin split apart, reshaping, reforming. He wasn't Alex anymore. He was becoming something else. The whispers were louder now, not just in his mind, but in the walls, in the air. He felt his body stretching, warping. His reflection in the bathroom mirror was no longer human. His mouth elongated, his fingers coiling into unnatural shapes. The tendrils had moved beyond his arm, threading through his ribs, winding around his heart. He tried to scream, but the sound that escaped his throat wasn't his own. He wasn't alone inside his body anymore. The thing inside him was awake. Days passed, or maybe hours. He couldn't tell anymore. Hunger gnawed at him, but it wasn't for food. His thoughts were no longer his own. They were shared, intertwined with something ancient and hungry. The apartment walls felt thinner. Something pulsed behind them. The thing inside him wanted to spread. He stumbled to his door, reaching for the knob, but his fingers had fused together, reshaped into something alien. The door felt wrong beneath his touch, too fragile, too temporary. He could hear them outside, the others. He wasn't the first. He wouldn't be the last. Then came the final transformation. His skin peeled away in long, paper-thin layers, revealing slick black sinew beneath. The floor beneath his feet darkened, the roots crawling outward, spreading. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth. His vision blurred, his senses overwhelmed by the rhythmic pulse of something unseen. Then, silence. When the landlord came looking for Alex 3 days later, the apartment was abandoned. The furniture was overturned, the bathroom sink filled with discarded bandages and dried blood. The only sign of him was a trail of dark, pulsing roots leading into the walls. And sometimes, late at night, neighbours swore they heard something scratching, growing. Your body is not always your own. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe and turn on notifications. But if something starts growing under your skin, don't ignore it. James was always hungry. At first he thought it was just his metabolism. Then the hunger started thinking for itself. James had never been overweight, but he had a reputation for eating more than anyone else. His friends joked about his endless appetite, about how he could eat a full meal and still want seconds. Then the cravings changed. It wasn't just food he wanted, it was meat. It started with raw steak, a rare craving, but manageable. Then he found himself eyeing roadkill on his morning jog. The smell of fresh blood in the butcher's shop made his mouth water. His stomach clenched, twisting painfully when he tried to resist. The hunger wasn't just a feeling anymore. It was a presence. It spoke. Feed me. James tried to fight it. He locked his fridge, avoided meat aisles, forced himself to eat normal food. But the hunger screamed inside his head, clawing at his insides. One night, he woke up to find himself in his kitchen. His hands were sticky, red. A half-eaten slab of raw meat sat on the counter. He had no memory of getting up. The hunger grew worse. His skin grew hot, his veins darkened. He avoided mirrors, but he could feel the changes beneath his skin. His teeth ached, sharpened. His jaw stretched unnaturally wide. One morning, his neighbour's dog went missing. That night, he caught his reflection in the window. His mouth was smiling, but he hadn't moved his lips. James locked himself in his apartment, wrapping himself in blankets, curling up in the bathtub, hoping it would pass. He tried to drink water, to flush it out, to drown it. But the thirst only made it worse. He stopped leaving the house. The world outside pulsed with the scent of living things, and it called to him. Every sound felt amplified, the rustle of a cat slinking through an alley, the footsteps of pedestrians on the pavement, the quiet hum of hearts beating just beyond his walls. The hunger whispered, "Just a taste." James squeezed his eyes shut, rocking himself like a child. He imagined his mother's voice, her soothing words when he'd been sick as a child. But the voice inside him was louder now. It pushed against his ribs, stretched through his fingertips. It was stronger than he was. Days passed, maybe weeks. He couldn't tell anymore. He barely remembered his own name, only the gnawing emptiness inside him. Then the knocking came, soft at first, then more urgent. James pressed his hands against his ears, trying to block it out. But his senses had changed. He could hear the person outside breathing. He could smell the iron-rich scent of their blood, warm and full. The doorknob rattled. James didn't remember moving, but suddenly he was at the door, his hand reaching for the knob. His fingers had changed, longer, sharper, the nails blackened like claws. He hesitated. Just a moment. Then the door burst open. They found his apartment empty, the doors clawed open from the inside. Blood trailed into the woods, vanishing among the trees. Some nights, hikers whisper about something in the forest, something that watches, something that breathes. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the whisper, "Still hungry." Not all hunger belongs to you. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe and turn on notifications. But if you ever crave something you shouldn't, don't give in. Ethan's skin had always been sensitive, but when it started peeling away, something else was underneath. The first flake of skin came off in the shower. Just a tiny patch, no bigger than a dime. He assumed it was dry skin, nothing serious. He applied lotion and ignored it. By morning his pillow was covered in peeled flesh. The more he scratched, the worse it got. The skin loosened like old wallpaper, curling at the edges, revealing a layer beneath, smooth, grey and not human. At first he thought it was raw muscle. But muscles didn't pulse like that. They didn't shift beneath his fingers. His skin wasn't shedding. It was being replaced. The sensation spread. His fingertips cracked, exposing a dark, glistening surface beneath. His reflection was unrecognizable, his face peeling away in ribbons, revealing something sleeker, something smiling beneath his old features. Then came the voices. "Almost ready?" The new skin didn't just cover him. It moved on its own, stretching, adjusting, testing itself. He tried to stop it, tried to bandage himself, tried to sew the old flesh back into place, but every morning more of it was gone, and the thing beneath was growing stronger. His lips peeled away, his teeth replaced by something sharper. His fingers lengthened, twitching at odd angles. His pupils stretched into slits. Then, a final whisper in his mind. Time to wake up. He blinked, and the old Ethan was gone. His reflection grinned at him. Not an awkward human smile, but something else. Something practiced. The skin stretched too easily over the bones, the eyes too dark, too deep. He touched his arm, feeling the last remnants of his human skin slough away. It wasn't painful anymore. It felt natural, like stepping out of an old, ill-fitting suit. He flexed his hands, testing the way the new skin moved. It was better, stronger. Then came the memories. They weren't his. They slithered into his mind, unbidden, fragments of another life, another existence, one where creatures like him walked unseen, blending in, waiting. The human form was temporary, a disguise. And Ethan, the real Ethan, had just been a shell. But now? Now he was whole. A knock at the door. His best friend, Mark. "Ethan, you okay? You haven't been answering your phone." Ethan turned toward the door, his grin widening. He could hear Mark's heartbeat through the wood, smell the sweat on his skin. Mark knocked again, firmer this time. "Ethan?" Ethan ran his tongue over his sharp teeth. He should answer, but how would Mark react when he saw what stood on the other side of the door? Something new, something waiting. Mark sighed and reached for the doorknob. When Mark's friends came looking for him days later, the apartment was empty. No sign of a struggle, no blood, just a pile of neatly folded skin on the bed. And in the mirror, something else was watching, smiling. Some changes can't be stopped. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe and turn on notifications. But if your skin ever starts to peel, don't look at what's underneath.